Good morning again, tubaneros. So, Zove, how can you give your video such a title? Just drumming up hits in your small fry channel? Because, as we know, the USA stands for the very principle of free and fair self-government, the empowerment of the ruled by the open selection of their rulers, from the best of their own ranks. And it aggressively, perhaps too aggressively, promotes this principle abroad. Well, that's certainly the propaganda, isn't it? Just as the Soviet Empire used the term socialist and the Spanish Empire called itself Christian, so does the U.S. Empire call itself democratic. And, like the others, by harnessing a redemptive ideal into the service of power, gut the adjective of all true meaning. That's why there is no real democracy promotion at work, wherever U.S. war boots tread, in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, or Afghanistan, and why the U.S. is not promoting real democracy via free elections in Libya or Syria, and why power must be settled first in its favor, with democracy added afterward like a frosting with sprinkles, purely for flavoring so the kiddies will buy it, a marketed substitute for real nutrition. One need only look at the history of democracy promotion in the 20th century when the U.S. announced its world mission to make the planet safe for democracy. One notorious example was Nicaragua, after the 1979 Sandinista Revolution. The Contra movement was promoted to bring democracy. They couldn't really say restore democracy because for decades the country had been in the grip of the Somoza private tyranny, and because the Somoza family were a useful imperial tool, there was no democracy promotion then for them. Democracy is something you push on enemies, not friends, because since they're friends, they're by definition members of the free world, no matter if they're the most scrofulous, miserable, grimy little tin pot tyrants of a given time zone. So, democracy could come to Nicaragua only by overthrowing the Marxist state tyrants in Managua, and then holding free elections to ratify and stabilize the victory thereof. To this end, hit-and-run terror and sabotage that would have done Al-Qaeda proud was sanctified by the holy jihad of democracy, which could be introduced only after the Marxist regime was crushed, no matter if the society and its people lay broken and bleeding in the rubble of their homes. Well, along came Gorbachev in the USSR, whose inspired genius was that he removed this ideological prop of U.S. empire by holding democracy in the lands of Lenin. The Sandinistas went for the idea, too, as a way of beating the Yankees at their own game, so they scheduled elections for February 1990, in which the political Contras could run in free competition with the ruling party. Confident of their mass mandate among the common folk, the Sandinistas predicted an easy margin of victory for themselves, ratified by the democratic process, robbing the empire of the North from all further honest pretext for continuing the war. But some advisors warned them against this project, notably Fidel Castro. Unlike the Sandinistas, Castro remembered how electoral politics had really worked in Cuba, controlled by a class of politicos and grafters who rigged elections and backroom trade-offs, selling out to the private interest with the fattest wallet, buying votes, or using intimidation at polling places, or police harassment of unfavored candidates. And of course there was the U.S. on hand to make sure that Jack didn't jump too far out of the box. So grimy and corrupt had electoral politics become in Cuba that when Fulgencio Batista staged his army coup and overthrew Cuba's elected president before the new round in '52, many breathed a sigh of relief that someone had turned out the crooks. That was one reason Castro did not reinstitute elections after his coming to power. The rebel army, having achieved victory by putting the lives of its combatants on the line, felt it had earned the moral authority to redeem the country, not by turning power back to the politicos, to piss away the honor of the country, back into the sewer, like country club alcoholics. He warned the Sandinistas that the only reason the Yankees were promoting elections was just to steal them. A harsh judgment. Was it deserved? Well, the Sandinistas never had any living experience with real electoral politics. They thought it would be a simple, ideal, by-the-book matter of just letting the campesinos stuff paper in a carton, trusting that they knew their best interests and would vote accordingly. When the results came in, these were quite different than the Sandinistas expected. They could only stare like dazed idiots, freshly fucked morons, hit between the eyes with a brick, as they saw they'd lost. How could this be? How could democracy have so betrayed them? Well, democracy didn't betray them so much as democracy itself was betrayed. The U.S. Supreme Court decision of Citizens United opened the floodgates of private soft money contributions into U.S. elections, but there had been no such restrictions in influencing foreign elections. NGOs, non-government organizations, based in the U.S., created local fronts in Nicaragua, stuffed money into the coffers of the National Opposition Union, brought their candidates into the U.S. for democracy training, and outspent the Sandinistas in market-skill advertising. So Nicaragua in 1990 had the freest and fairest election money could buy in its history. But surely that wasn't the whole story, Zove. The Nicaraguans wouldn't have given the opposition such a victory if they didn't really want change. And that's true. That is the second most, but very important reason. After a decade of U.S.-fostered civil war, a war-weary population hoped that an opposition victory might pacify the U.S. and the country, remove the reason for war by replacing the Sandinistas. Threats to renew the war if the opposition lost convinced many voters to cast their ballots as freely as if a loaded gun had been held directly at their heads. So, you see the pattern. Democracy must take place on the terms and agenda set by the U.S. It must control the playing field, or, failing that, must have the threat of violence handy in case its anointed candidate loses. A zero-sum game of heads I win, no matter how it's played. A Faustian bargain indeed. But we've seen this before in 1990, in the Dominican Republic, by overthrowing the social democratic government of Juan Bosch in 1965, via direct intervention, and then holding free elections, making sure the right-wing bureaucrat Joaquin Balaguer won, or in South Vietnam, ensuring Ngo Dinh Diem won with the army at the voters' back, keeping him locked into the free world. What does all this have to do with the USA in the modern era? Hasn't it learned from those bad old days? I don't see any proof of that. If anything, it's more arrogant than ever, and proof of this is how it brought democracy to Libya, and is now bringing democracy to Syria. In Libya, there was no question of demanding elections between Gaddafi and the opposition, not on the part of Gaddafi, who seemed ready for such an option before the mess was over, but on the part of NATO and Hillary Clinton. Rather than seeing ballots over bullets, NATO and the U.S. decided beforehand, and over the heads of the Libyan electorate, that Gaddafi would have to go first, and only then would there be anything like an election. In other words, the most viable opponent to the will of NATO would have to be removed by force, with the anti-Gaddafi opposition in control of the election process and NATO in control of them. The same scenario was being worked out for Syria. Rather than advocate a political solution to the violence in Syria, an election between Assad and the Ba'ath Party and the opposition, the West is demanding Assad and the Ba'ath be overthrown first by Syrian Contras, and only then will the field be clear for free and fair elections, namely of candidates that NATO and the U.S. State Department have vetted as properly democratic. The actual will of the Syrian people is to be expressed by the in loco parentis rule of the big principal in Washington, and a student council body whose main job is to organize the senior prom, not the administration of sovereign power. So, democracy is permitted only when it's safe, when the candidates selected by outside forces have the road to victory unencumbered by speed limits, traffic signs, red lights, or police radar, and can use that victory to entrench themselves in power in perpetuity. It may be a people's republic, as in post-war Poland, but it's not democracy in any meaningful sense of the term. And you can bet that there is no NATO war cry over the Egyptian military sabotaging the democratic process, just helpless head-shaking in W-Town. Uh-oh. Probably Homeland Security again, because I badmouthed Hillary. Hello. Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin? Yeah, I guess you still have that title, don't you? You just want to tell our viewing audience they better get used to the idea of safe democracy? That come November, the opposition is going to blow Obama out of the water just like he did Gaddafi? Well, I hope not literally. But you folks are going to ensure the election process stays free and fair from now on. How will we know? We don't have to? Just go back to sleep and let the Koch brothers manage it all? It's politicians like you that make Fidel Castro and Gaddafi look good after all.